building on the topic of like programmable materials, I would like to introduce Veronica Rana. She is a QM PhD student at Information Experience Design, and she aims to mediate and negotiate an emerging biodigital knowledge, space its novel interface and its grassroots, and her aim how design research can facilitate a meaningful engagement between scientists and non-scientists. Thank you so much. Ich habe mich versprochen.
So, as Helene just said, I'm in IED and also in the Creative Exchange, which is a hub at the RCA, and name should be program. I'm interested in exchanges with other institutions, with different disciplines, and that is pretty much what my work is all about. And my most recent project is called Polyphonic Futures, and that's actually in a way to do with the material silk, where it concerns the biodigital, the elusive term biodigital, and its resulting interfaces, and what kind of role design plays in this interplay. Biodigital is presumably a little bit of a difficult term, so I'm gonna run you quickly through a few things, how it can be understood, or how it's in traditional classic sense is understood. So I'm gonna take a look back in history and have a look at Erhard Schön, who did these incredibly remarkable wooden cuts in the 15th century, which look incredibly like modern and up to date to me, if you ask me. He was a pupil of Albrecht Dürer and came up with these proportions and bodies in space, and in an effort to kind of see how bodies are measured. This is one potential approach how digital and biological could meet. Another way how to digitally or like computationally approach the body are, for example, here these illustrations by Fritz Kahn, another German, who created these intricate illustrations of bodies as machines or buildings, and all these body functions are sort of explained in quite rational, quite factory style, and in very, very dry terms. So this kind of a metaphor and analogy serve us here to kind of match the digital and computational with the biological, and serves us as a means to kind of understand ourselves better. Another way of looking at the biodigital is, for example, depicting the body or biological matter through digital means. So here you can see, for example, this 3D corpse, which is a sort of immersive environment that is basically there to teach surgeons how to kind of look into a corpse for educational purposes, or to kind of unravel tissues and really have a look at all the different layers. Another way of looking at it is like looking a bit more in the future and how we kind of like to understand the biodigital and how we currently do that. It's really worth questioning that, because when people think about body enhancement or materials that can enter the body, we're very quickly in this visual stereotype of cyborgs, and they're very gendered as well. And it's quite important to really go back and revisit these visuals, because they might have actually more subtle, more meaningful, and more interesting and poetic ways of thinking the biodigital. So they critique with all of these ways of looking at the biodigital is like they all share, have the graphesis in common, like sort of transmitting knowledge from A to B through graphical terms. And they're very stereotypical, and they kind of convey a relationship with the digital that doesn't really apply anymore nowadays, because it can be now in script and hidden in products. It can go into living materials. It can go into animals, genes, and plants. And algorithms become invisible agents that influence our very behavior from the within. So we have a quick look what type of biodigital interfaces do currently exist, and the ones, I just want to bring 2 examples so we can actually see the ones that are most familiar. So like these biomedical devices here, for example, like continuous glucose monitoring that interfaces with the skin and kind of gives a graphical output. For example, in the top bottom left, like time series graph is like very common digital output for measured biological data. Then here in the bottom right, you have heart defibrillator and pacemaker that quite severely interface with biological matter. Again, it's utilized to kind of transmit knowledge, to translate it through computational terms, but it's not really kind of seamlessly interface with the actual tissue, the actual biological material. And we have a look a bit more on most recent attempts. For example, the bottom one is a study called SkinPut, and it utilizes the body and the skin surface as an input device, which is in itself a little bit of a difficult attempt because you're actually just turning yourself into a computer screen rather than actually doing something with the tissue itself. But on the top you can see a silken tattoo, which is already an electronic device, which is already very elegant and hints towards a very delicate and subtle future that we can think of collectively as designers. So I think it's really important to kind of question the biodigital before we even kind of look at the reverse engineered silk. I'm going to talk you through in a bit, because it is very strongly influenced by technocratic belief, and we need to kind of question that in order to unravel a fuller and better potential. So also it is really important to kind of look into the collision of the biodigital and what that actually means and where the problem lies. So you have here biological material, which is as such different from the digital because it's living and it has active agency, no matter if people look at it or not. It's contextual, it's interdependent, dynamic, and interconnected to a natural system. The digital, however, is humanly created, is anthropocentric and constructed, and it allows for readability and connecting entities through the human lens. In itself, it doesn't have active or self-directed agency. Without human intervention, it's basically meaningless. So what the digital shares, though, with the biological is characteristics of the model it simulates. But the digital in itself is not biological, not living, and has no active agency. So you see, there's a dynamic system and a static system. The question I really have is, can we think of a material-induced biosensing paradigm that could change that, something that really comes from within, a digitality that emerges from programmable materials? So I'm going to bring a little example to kind of shake you a little bit up. So on the left you can see something again from the past, quite a while ago, 15th century again. They were quite progressive back then. This is, if you want, the Ulrich Pinder, another German, was one of the first self-trackers, quantified self-trackers. He actually collected his own urine and put it in a wheel, in a chart, and kind of traced the color and sort of cognitive factors and sensory factors to see whether or not he's healthy or not. On the right hand, you can see the more or less most recent technology, transient electronics. In the lab, I'm actually working in at Tufts University called Silk Lab. Here you can see a piece of electronic that is fabricated on a piece of dissolvable silk that can dissolve in water and, yeah, basically disappear without a trace in a programmable time that you can give to the material incredibly precise. What these two things have in common is the non-numerical collection and reflection on the data. It has a material consistency, and the data equals the display. and it allows for tight feedback loops for reflection. So reverse engineered silk might be a programmable biomaterial, and it turns effectively the body in a programmable site. So I'm going to quickly explain you the process of reverse engineering silk. As you can see, the material is very crude in the beginning. It's an animal-based protein. And this is a very simplified process overview. They have like mulberry leaves in the beginning, caterpillars, cocoons. You basically bring that material back into a solution, and it's a recombinant silk. It's not entirely the same like in the silkworm, but then you turn out with something that is incredibly close to current plastics and very familiar to materials we already know. It's a very satisfying aesthetic quality, and also, even more so, it can be implanted into the human body without rejection. This is the most remarkable quality and the only biomaterial that can actually do so at the moment. So this is, for example, how the material looks like. It's a solution, and it's bendy silken film I just demonstrated, and it's 100% silk and nothing else. What you can see here is this material offers, once turned back into the solution, a sort of material platform that can be used for all sorts of different material aggregation states. Gels, sponges, microspheres, tubes, and so on and so on. But the most remarkable ability is still that it can go into the body and build a digital gateway into the body, and this is what I'm interested in. So here are more different aggregation states, just a few snaps. So I came up with this concept, UI silk interfacing the body based on these observations. And that was really, really important. So here you can see, for example, a very common sensing paradigm. You start with the digital technology, and then going through numerical output, diagnosis, and prescribed medical treatment. Quickly, you see the gray parts here are the more like the statical components. And the only state where the designer can be actually involved and where meaning making happens is actually the blue one, where the graphical user interface design happens. So the designer is not really involved anymore. In more than that, and that's, I think, also where the problem lies. When you look at silken sensing, it starts actually with the material and not a digital sensing device, which is very different, as you can see, because it starts interfacing with the tissue. And based on this interaction, based on the dissolving in the tissue, you can actually, the sensing results from that. There's no numerical translation happening. So that brought me to the conclusion that as a designer working for transients, working for possibilities with silk, I need to understand the full process. I need to teach other people this process. Otherwise, we will not be able to kind of open this up. This is a little concept I've done. It was sort of based on these observations, a coupled silken device for personalized medicine. And biggest question I had, or like became quickly clear to me, I've been studying silk for a couple of years now, it affords transdisciplinarity. It's not possible to kind of really work from A to Z alone on this material, and that's very interesting. Designers are also very welcome in this field. It's very, very new. This is an old piece of work of mine, biophilia organ crafting. That's when I started with silken research. And what I thought was interesting here, I started with a very visionary, poetic concept. 4 or 5 years later, we were actually almost, we're planning to make this real. So I was interested in artist-led speculation, but I found it difficult that it always ends up in the gallery and it doesn't really go back and to the scientists to create feedback loops. It's unfortunately, when I'm doing this as an artist, it's insufficient variety because it constrains it. Because I'm not opening this up, I can only pick ever so much. And the exchanges with the scientists are not visible. I'm only picking specific maybe even sensational elements of these conversations and turn them into a design. So I came to polyphonic futuring, which is different because polyphony means several voices at the same time without hierarchy implied. So I'm interested here in opening up to increase the requisite variety, increase a resilient system for an emerging technology that's just about to happen, and for inviting debate. So I'm translating lab experience from the residency I did in Silk Lab in Boston towards collaborative speculation, where I invite people in and make them experience the same things like I did in the lab in a sort of broken down version. So I have these workshop series that actually circulates between experts and non-experts, and I'm basically mediating these different pieces of information and knowledge to them so they can actually respond to that, and I'll feed it back to them. Stage 1 is where I'm visualizing and exchanging with the chosen audience. And in stage 2, it will hopefully, once this experiment is more or less completed, turn it back to the scientists, and we find some more practical solution in there that we can actually start with some lab experimentation. So I'm interested in designing for possibility and transience through collaborative speculation. So designing for transience involves the cognitive, the affective, spatial and quantitative elements of biological and digital, and as such is a much more broader field, is very different from designing objects, but designing systems. I found this quote quite interesting. In the past, our technologically conceived artifacts structured living patterns. We are now in transition from an object-oriented to a systems-oriented culture. Here, change emanates not from things, but from the way things are done. I think this is quite an interesting quote, because like you really go back to the origins of the idea creation and how these things actually met, how art and science, design and science exchange can facilitate a systemic thinking, systemic design. So I did these, started with workshop kits that I developed iteratively further. Then started with the first pilot at University of Greenwich during a conference, doing these like rather crude silken objects to kind of convey the idea of transient materials that don't last forever and electronics that dissolve in your body to kind of inspire and instigate debate. Here was another week-long workshop with students from Zurich University of the Arts. Obviously the outputs were a lot more refined and of better quality because students had more time. So we tested silk now as a platform with carbon, with fluorescent colors, bioluminescent colors, electroluminescence, and really started to kind of actuate the material as well. The most recent workshop was in collaboration with the Arts Catalyst in London and Furtherfield, and we invited experts to join us for a weekend, and where we really thought in more narrative terms: design your silken self. How would you enhance a version of yourself through silk? The outputs were incredibly engaging and incredibly creative, and it was very intense. And as you can see, we used a range of transient materials. And the outputs of these workshops are currently designed and are fed into a collaborative platform that are then brought back to the scientists for them to comment on. I've done it in such a following way that I'm kind of using almost something that scientists are a bit more familiar with like sort of questionnaires or vignettes, and something they're not so scared of when they see a beautiful, high-end, refined design object. They feel less encouraged to comment on it. If it's like kept in a sort of rough state, they feel like very, very entitled and encouraged to give their own opinions. So we had these like classifications from designers where they looked into educational silk, personal implantables, medical practitioners, and all these clusters and groups emerged out of these various ideas that people came up with. And the scientists commented their own views on this. Like they instantly thought of personalized bacteriophage therapy or plug-in health, or they thought of semantic closure. And all of a sudden you started to connect design with theory and with science around the same topic and a very tangible and more tangible becoming object. So what we're currently working on, me and my project partners, Arts Catalyst, Imperial College, Tufts University, and myself, we're looking into the Polyphonic Futures platform, where all these ideas and exchanges are collided, traced over time, and for people to kind of develop them further and submit their own ideas, so we can really think of some interesting sort of futures. Thank you very much.